I always knew Karen liked power, but I didn't know she'd start building her little empire on land that didn't belong to her. Mine. It started with some yellow velvet rope tied between metal stakes in my side yard. Then came the voices, the clinking glasses, the rolling carts full of wine bottles and polished silver. And finally the sight of Karen in heels and designer sunglasses, waving her clipboard like she was queen of the subdivision. She called it a VIP HOA Lounge, a private retreat for board members only. Tent walls with chandeliers, white couches on my grass, champagne chillers, velvet armchairs. I stood in my own driveway and watched people sip wine on my property, like I didn't exist. When I confronted her, she smirked and told me to take it up with the board that met inside my lot. That's when I realized she thought she could get away with it, thought I'd stay quiet, thought I'd play by the rules. But she didn't know what I really do for a living. She had no idea that I run a demolition company. So I did take it up with someone. My crew? And what came next? Well, let's just say the wine wasn't the only thing chilling that day. Before we dive back in, I just want to say, these stories are made with a lot of care, imagination, and a deep love for the strange. If this kind of weird little adventure speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for being part of the journey. Now, back to the story. It was a Thursday morning, still cool enough that the dew hadn't burned off the grass. I stepped out with my coffee, ready to enjoy 10 peaceful minutes before work, when I saw something that made me stop cold. There was rope in my yard, not the kind you tie around a tree or use for hauling. This was velvet, bright yellow velvet rope, like the kind you see outside VIP clubs. It was strung between shiny chrome posts, creating a little boundary around the corner of my side lot. My lot, my land. I blinked, thinking maybe it was some weird neighborhood prank, but then I noticed the small pink construction flags scattered through the grass, each with a tiny handwritten tag fluttering in the breeze. They weren't from me. I hadn't scheduled any work. I hadn't approved anything. Then I heard it. Voices, laughter, glasses clinking. It was coming from the other side of the hedges that lined the edge of my lot. I followed the sound, still in my slippers, and peeked through the branches. I had to look twice. Someone had set up white tents, big ones, with gold trim and sheer curtains. Inside, there were folding tables covered in linen cloths, coolers filled with bottles, stacks of silver trays. It looked like a party, or worse, a setup. And in the middle of it all was Karen, standing tall, arms crossed, sunglasses on even in the shade. She was directing 2 workers who were setting down flooring panels on top of my grass, my actual grass. She nodded with satisfaction as they unrolled fake turf over the flooring like it was some kind of luxury spa. "Yeah, let's make sure the perimeter is fully closed off," she said to one of the workers. "Only board members inside the lounge today. No guests." The word lounge hit me like a slap. I stepped back, heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I headed straight inside, grabbed the survey map from my office drawer, and laid it out on the table. That side lot? Fully within my boundary lines, not HOA controlled, not shared space, nothing even close. I looked back out the window. Karen was still out there, sipping something pink from a glass with a lime wedge. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. That woman had roped off my land like it was her weekend retreat. And if I knew Karen, this was only the beginning. But I already knew how it was going to end. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't even have to knock. Karen saw me marching across the grass and met me halfway, heels digging into the turf like it belonged to her. She had that smug little smirk on her face, the one she wore at every HOA meeting when someone dared to question her authority. "Oh, good, you're here," she said, like she'd been waiting for me. "We've just about finished setting up." I stared at her, stunned. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" Karen laughed lightly, like I was a child asking why the sky was blue. It's part of the HOA's seasonal event plan. The board voted to repurpose this lot as a temporary lounge and meeting space. You should have received the notice. She said it like it was already decided, like she was doing me a favor. I didn't receive anything, I said flatly. Well, she shrugged. Maybe it got lost. Either way, it's happening. It's only temporary. I could see workers in branded polos unloading speakers and catering equipment. A guy with a clipboard was measuring the distance between the tent and the hedge line. Someone else was pushing a rolling fridge across the lawn. They didn't even look at me, like I was invisible. It's not HOA land, Karen. That lot is part of my parcel. She waved a hand dismissively. Not exactly. There's some ambiguity about shared easements in the bylaws, and until that's cleared up, the board has decided to move forward. Ambiguity. She actually said that with a straight face. I pulled out my phone and started recording. You're trespassing. None of this was approved by me. That's my land. Karen looked right at the camera, completely unbothered. You're welcome to submit a formal complaint. There's a process. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to make it personal. Or, you could be part of something special for once. This is a big step forward for the community. Don't be the guy who stands in the way. And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the tents. I stood there for a long time, watching my side yard transform into her personal event space. She wasn't asking, she wasn't negotiating, she was declaring. And the worst part, she genuinely believed she could get away with it. I went back inside and opened my filing cabinet. Karen had no idea who she was playing with, but she was about to find out. The next morning, I watched it all unfold like some twisted neighborhood reality show. Trucks lined the curb, hazard lights blinking, while Karen strutted around, giving orders like a wedding planner on a power trip. They were setting up luxury tents, not the kind you rent for a birthday party either. These were the kind you'd see at a celebrity wedding. White canvas stretched tight over gold-plated frames. Sheer curtains billowed in the breeze, tied back with satin ribbons. It was absurd, it was theatrical, and it was happening on my lawn. Two men rolled out a fake hardwood dance floor, while another guy hoisted up a chandelier. A chandelier. I stood at my window gripping my coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping me from snapping. A forklift beeped as it offloaded a massive chrome fridge with clear glass doors, already stocked with rows of champagne bottles. Labels facing out, of course. Karen was everywhere at once, clipboard in hand, barking orders while pretending to be gracious. I heard her talking to one of the caterers. Yes, just the top-shelf vintages. This is a board-only event. No guests, no kids, no nonsense. Board only. She wasn't even hiding it. This wasn't some community celebration. This was a private VIP club for Karen and her inner circle, the same 4 board members who always nodded along to her ideas without question. The same people who fined Mrs. Patel last week for leaving her recycling bin out 12 minutes past pickup. Now they were sipping champagne on my grass. I walked outside just in time to see a guy hammering a stake into the ground near my property marker. He paused when he saw me, looking unsure. "Hey," I called out, "you know you're on private land, right?" He blinked. Karen said this was HOA approved." "She says a lot of things," I muttered, walking past him. Karen spotted me instantly and intercepted, all smiles. "Isn't it beautiful?" she beamed. "You should be proud. This corner's finally being put to good use." I didn't answer, just looked past her at the champagne fridge, now plugged into a gas generator, buzzing like a hornet. "You're not invited, by the way," she added, lowering her voice. "Board members only. Liability issues." Then she winked. I turned and walked away before I did something stupid. She'd made herself at home on my land. Now it was my turn to return the favor. I didn't sleep that night. My head was spinning with questions and a burning need to prove what I already knew. That land was mine, not shared, not disputed, not HOA managed, mine. By sunrise, I was pacing the edge of my property line with a printed survey map in hand, checking every marker, every stake, every inch of lawn that Karen had invaded. The original parcel lines were crystal clear. The side lot was well within my boundaries. And yet, the yellow rope still stood, slicing across it like it belonged to someone else. Around mid-morning, I saw Karen in her usual spot, now perched on a velvet ottoman beneath the largest tent. She was sipping from a crystal flute and flipping through what looked like a stack of glossy papers. When she saw me approaching, she didn't even stand. "Oh, good," she said. "We need to align on visuals." "On what?" She held up one of the pages, a large map printed in color, laminated like something you'd pass out at a real estate expo. "This," she said proudly, "is the new proposed green expansion overlay. It outlines Phase 3 of the HOA's beautification plan. See here?" She pointed to a soft green shaded area labeled Community Lounge Development. My lot. I took the map and stared at it. The lines were all wrong. The boundaries had been redrawn to include my side yard as part of the communal space. The legend in the corner listed a revision date from last month, conveniently after the last board meeting, which I hadn't attended. "This isn't a real map," I said flatly. Karen raised an eyebrow. "It's board certified. It's not legally recorded." "It will be," she said with a little shrug. "It's already been submitted for review. The board voted. It's just a formality now." She was talking like this was already decided, like it was a done deal. You can't redraw property lines with a vote. Karen smiled wider. "Oh, I think you'll find the HOA has more flexibility than you realize. We're thinking of naming this area Thompson Park. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" She laughed and turned away before I could answer, shouting something about flower arrangements to one of the decorators. I stood there holding her fake map, my blood boiling. She wasn't just trespassing, she was rewriting reality, one laminated lie at a time. I folded the map and stuck it in my back pocket. I was done talking. It was time to build my own plan, one that ended with her little tent kingdom in pieces. By Friday evening, the transformation was complete. What used to be a quiet patch of grass next to my driveway now looked like a luxury pop-up resort. White tents glowed under soft string lights. Classical music played from hidden speakers. Waiters in black aprons floated around with silver trays, offering tiny hors d'oeuvres that looked more like decoration than food. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching a line of board members and their spouses strut past the yellow velvet rope like they were walking into a five-star gala. One guy actually took a selfie at the entrance under a sign that read, "HOA Executive Social, Invitation Only." Across the street, a few neighbors had gathered on their lawns, watching in silence. Some looked amused, others confused. A few clearly didn't know whether they were allowed to walk over or not. Karen, of course, didn't hesitate to make the boundaries clear. She was posted at the tent entrance like a gatekeeper, wearing a floor-length floral dress, oversized sunglasses, and a badge clipped to her sash that said, HOA Chairwoman. She air-kissed guests as they arrived and whispered instructions to her waitstaff with one finger raised like she was royalty. Every now and then she'd glance over at me and smirk, as if daring me to interrupt her big moment. I didn't move, didn't wave, just stared. Inside the tent, laughter grew louder. The cork from a champagne bottle popped, and a cheer went up. Music shifted to some kind of smooth jazz remix. The entire thing was ridiculous. Dozens of people sipping overpriced wine, relaxing in armchairs that sat on top of my land. I could hear Karen giving a little welcome speech through a wireless mic. She thanked the board for their visionary leadership and praised the HOA's continued investment in the community's long-term cultural health. Cultural health. I nearly choked on my coffee. Then she said something that made me freeze. "We're so proud to be hosting this event on the newly designated Thompson Green, our future centerpiece of HOA enrichment." Thompson Green. She'd named my land, out loud, into a microphone. There was polite applause, more toasts, more laughter, more glasses clinking. Karen twirled in place like she was hosting a gala in Monaco, not throwing a private party in someone else's yard. And yet, no one stopped her. No one questioned it. Not yet. But I was done watching. Karen wanted to play queen? I was about to remind her what happens when you build castles on stolen ground. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Ellison 2 doors down. Sweet lady, retired teacher, never involved in drama, but her voice had a sharpness I'd never heard before. "Did you know we were billed for last night's gathering?" she asked. "Billed how?" She explained that an extra $42 had appeared on her monthly HOA dues, labeled as a community improvement fee. No explanation, no vote. Just a quiet little line item tucked into her statement. She'd called the HOA office, only to be told it was for exclusive member enrichment and not up for discussion. That was all I needed to hear. I started calling around. 3 neighbors, then 5, then 10. Every single one had the same charge, some higher, some lower, and all of them had not been invited to the exclusive enrichment. And that wasn't the only thing. According to Jerry, one of the newer homeowners who just happened to be a web developer, Karen had quietly launched a private sign-up page. It offered VIP HOA access for select members. A suggested donation of $100 got you into priority events, with Karen's champagne tent being the first. The kicker? The payment went to a personal PayPal account under her name. My land was the backdrop for a money funnel. And she was charging people to stand on it. The more I dug, the worse it got. The rentals, the tents, the flooring, the lights, they'd been booked through a shell company linked to her cousin. The champagne was ordered in bulk using the HOA's general fund. And the invoice for land preparation was approved for reimbursement, with my address listed under site work. She hadn't just stolen my space, she was laundering her ego through it, turning my yard into her personal throne room and making every homeowner pay for the crown. I walked back outside, toes pressing into the patch of grass just behind the hedge line. I could still see the imprint where their fake turf had been rolled out. A few champagne corks littered the corner by the hedge. I knelt down, grabbed one, and squeezed it in my palm until it cracked. That was it. She was using my land, my name, and our neighbor's money to live out her HOA fantasy, and everyone was too intimidated or confused to stop her, but not me. I wasn't going to another meeting. I wasn't filing a complaint. I wasn't waiting for some slow-moving vote. Number I was going to hit her where it hurt, right in the middle of her plastic paradise. City Hall was quieter than I expected, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the click of keyboards behind glass windows. I walked up to the planning department with a folder under my arm and a knot in my stomach. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I needed proof. The clerk behind the counter, Melissa, was kind, sharp, and fast. She didn't blink when I told her I needed original survey records, easement documentation, and any zoning changes filed under the HOA's name in the last 12 months. She just asked for my address and started typing. 10 minutes later, I had a stack of records laid out on the counter. Parcel maps, deed histories, subdivision plans, and one thing became very, very clear. My side lot was never part of the HOA. Not in the original subdivision plan, not in the deed, not in the zoning overlays. There was no easement, no shared use clause, no mention of it in any HOA agreement. I was grandfathered out before the HOA ever formed. I wasn't even supposed to be getting their newsletters. And yet, there it was, my address, listed on a document submitted just 3 weeks ago titled Community Expansion Plan, Phase 3, signed by Karen herself, filed under her name. The attached map was the same one she waved in my face, the one with the shaded green section labeled Thompson Green. She'd forged new boundaries and filed them with the city without a vote, without a public notice, and without informing me. She claimed it was pending approval, but the form was incomplete. No signatures, no permits, nothing legal about it. Just a fake document attached to a real land grab. I turned to Melissa, still holding the papers. "Can I get copies of all of this?" "Sure," she said. "But if you're filing a dispute, you'll want to speak to zoning enforcement. This looks questionable." That was putting it mildly. By the time I left, I had a manila envelope full of evidence and a business card for a city attorney who handled land misuse cases like this all the time. I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine. Karen hadn't just overstepped. She'd committed real fraud, paper trail fraud, public record fraud. She had no idea how badly she'd screwed up. And now, I wasn't just angry. I was armed, legally, officially. And I was done playing nice. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I parked outside an old warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place no one notices unless they're looking for it. I hadn't been there in over a year, but the guys hadn't changed. Still, the same gravel lot, same rusted signage, same half-empty coffee cups balanced on truck dashboards. I walked through the open bay door and was greeted with the warm, oily smell of diesel and metal. And then I saw them, my old crew. 3 of the hardest working guys I'd ever known, covered in dust, cracking jokes over a busted excavator. Frank looked up first. "Well, I'll be damned. The boss man returns." I didn't smile, just held up the envelope from City Hall. "I've got a situation," I said. They circled around while I laid out the whole story, the tents, the parties, the fake map, Karen's little VIP kingdom built right on top of my land. Frank whistled low. "She really filed with the city? That's gutsy." "More like stupid," I said. "And illegal." Tony leaned back against a workbench, arms crossed. "So, what do you want done?" I slid a paper across the table, a printed copy of the city's parcel map with my lot clearly outlined. I want it cleared. Every tent, every chair, every smug little champagne cooler, gone, and I want it done by the book. Frank nodded slowly. "Permits?" I reached into the envelope and handed him the stamped approval for a nuisance structure removal. Signed by zoning enforcement, effective immediately. "Pulled this morning," I said. "Karen's stunt crossed into criminal, but I want to handle it clean, legal, loud." The crew exchanged grins like kids about to take a joyride. "We'll need to prep the site," Tony said. "Mark out access, set buffer zones. Standard run?" "Sunrise," I said. "No warning. Let her wake up to it." They laughed, already walking toward the back to grab gear lists. I stood there a moment longer, watching them slip into motion. This wasn't just demolition. It was precision. The kind of job where every crack of concrete meant something. By the time I left, the plan was locked in. Equipment scheduled, crew ready, permits in place. Karen had thrown her little HOA gala, soaked in champagne and praise. But her after-party? That was going to be all mine. And I'd make sure she had a front row seat when her empire collapsed. Saturday night arrived like a movie premiere, the kind where everyone dresses up but no one quite knows why. By 7 o'clock, our quiet street was lined with SUVs and luxury sedans. Valet boys, yes, valet boys, were parking cars in driveways that didn't belong to them. Karen had even roped off a section of the cul-de-sac with cones and handwritten signs that said, "Private event, VIP access only." I stood in the shadows of my own porch watching the spectacle unfold like a bad dream. A string quartet played softly beneath the tent canopy. Women in cocktail dresses clinked glasses of sparkling rosé while board members posed for photos in front of a vinyl banner that said, HOA Gala, a night of vision and unity. The hypocrisy was almost beautiful. Karen was at the center of it all, of course, draped in what looked like a custom gown, microphone in hand, glowing like some suburban monarch. She gave her speech around 8, talked about legacy, about community pride, about the visionary steps the HOA was taking to expand member experiences. Not a single mention that they were standing on land she didn't own. Not a word about the bogus documents, the stolen funds, the fraudulent permit filings. Just smiles and toasts and the click of heels on temporary floorboards. I walked the perimeter as quietly as I could, watching people sip wine on the very grass I'd seeded with my own hands. There was no security, just a few hired caterers and a couple of teenage helpers Karen had probably underpaid. They didn't even glance at me. At one point she spotted me. I saw the flicker of recognition, the tightening around her eyes. She raised her glass slightly, a silent jab, then turned back to her guests. She had no idea that her empire was already marked and measured, that her precious vision had an expiration date, stamped and signed. No idea that the zoning office had already closed the book on her fake expansion plan, or that a demolition crew was set to arrive just before sunrise. She was too busy drinking her own Kool-Aid, literally and figuratively. The string quartet shifted into a jazzy version of some pop song I didn't recognize. Neighbors who used to complain about potholes were now slow dancing under tent lights strung across my airspace. I walked home, locked the door, and set an alarm for 5:45 a.m. Karen could have her night. Tomorrow, she'd wake up to mine. The sky was just starting to pinken with morning light when I stepped outside, demolition order in hand. The tent city was still standing, silent now, except for the soft hum of the generator keeping Karen's champagne fridge cold. But in a few minutes, it wouldn't be. I walked across my lawn like I owned the place, because I did. The stakes were still in the ground, the velvet rope still tied, but none of it meant anything now. I could already hear the rumble of diesel engines a few streets over, right on schedule. Karen was already out there, believe it or not, dressed in a silk robe and fuzzy slippers, sipping something from a crystal glass. She looked hungover, but satisfied, like a queen surveying her kingdom the morning after victory. She spotted me and rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she muttered. "If you're here to sulk, just don't. It's too early for your little property tantrums." I didn't say a word, just handed her the folded packet of papers, city seal, permit numbers, zoning violations, demolition approval, all stamped, all legal. She barely glanced at it. "What is this, some kind of joke?" "Nope," I said loud enough for the early walkers and curious neighbors to hear. "This is your official notice of removal, structure teardown authorized by zoning enforcement under Municipal Code 3.14. She blinked, looking down at the papers again. This time her face changed. She turned pale. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass. "You're bluffing," she said. "You can't. This is an HOA property event." "It's not HOA property," I said calmly. "It never was. And by the time the city opens Monday morning, this tent will be a memory." That's when the engines roared. The sound echoed down the block like thunder rolling in. A massive flatbed truck pulled around the corner, hauling a backhoe and a pair of portable dumpsters. Behind it came a smaller utility vehicle stacked with cones, fencing, and equipment. People began to gather on their lawns in robes and pajamas. Karen's guests, still sleeping in nearby houses, started to peek out windows, squinting into the sunrise. I turned to the growing crowd, lifted the papers high, and declared it plainly. "This structure is being removed per city order, today." Karen dropped her glass. It shattered on the fake flooring. "You can't do this," she whispered, but I already had. And the champagne tent? It had just popped its last cork. The first bite of steel hit the side panel just as the sun crested over the rooftops. A clean, tearing sound, like a zipper splitting in slow motion. The fabric walls didn't stand a chance. They flapped once in the breeze, then collapsed inward like a dying breath. Karen screamed, not a little gasp, not a protest. A full-blown scream, the kind you hear in movies when the villain finally realizes the trap has snapped shut. She stood there frozen, hands out, robe dragging in the grass, as my demolition crew rolled across the lawn like thunder on wheels. Frank, always theatrical, tipped his hard hat at her as the backhoe bucket dropped onto the champagne fridge. The shatter was immediate. Glass, ice, bubbly. It all exploded under the weight like a sad fireworks show in broad daylight. Karen lunged forward. "Stop! Stop this right now! This is unlawful! This is harassment! This is—" Tony cut the engine. "Ma'am, we're operating under full city clearance. You're standing on a demolition site. I strongly suggest you step back unless you'd like to be escorted off the property." She whirled on me, hair a mess, voice shrill. "You're doing this to humiliate me." I didn't answer. I just watched as the second tent went down. The chandeliers clinked like wind chimes before vanishing into a pile of crushed tubing and torn canvas. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, silent at first, then whispering, some filming, some just staring. I noticed a few of Karen's loyal board members quietly slipping away, heading back toward their cars, probably realizing their little wine-soaked empire had a paper trail that led straight to Karen's forged signature. The last tent stood alone, her main pavilion, the one with the printed banner still hanging lopsided above the entrance. A night of vision and unity. Frank didn't hesitate. He lowered the bucket and drove straight through it. The banner tore clean down the middle. By the time the crew finished, the yard looked like a battlefield. Splintered wood, bent poles, piles of what used to be exclusive seating, and right at the center of it all, Karen, motionless, barefoot, staring into the mess like she couldn't believe the champagne had stopped flowing. The only thing left standing was the property marker. The original one, the real one. I pointed to it. "You see that? That's the line you crossed." She didn't respond. Because finally, Karen had nothing left to say. The shouting started as soon as the last piece of tent frame hit the dumpster. Karen was pacing in circles now, robe flapping, barefoot on the torn-up lawn, mascara smudged from whatever meltdown she'd had in between screams. Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control of the moment. "This is a violation of HOA protocol," she barked. "You can't just destroy approved community structures. There are bylaws, procedures, votes." Frank, stacking debris at the curb, didn't even look up. "Lady, this isn't a clubhouse. It's trespassing." She turned to the small crowd forming on the sidewalk. Neighbors, former friends, a few board members who now stood awkwardly apart, suddenly unsure which team they were on. "You all saw this," she shouted, arms flailing. "This is abuse of power. He's retaliating. This is illegal." Then came the cherry on top. A white van with a local news logo rolled up and parked across the street. The camera crew stepped out fast, mics and lenses already aimed. I hadn't called them. Someone else had. Maybe Mrs. Ellison, maybe Jerry with the website screenshots. Didn't matter. The timing was perfect. Karen froze when she saw the cameras, straightened her back, smoothed her robe, then put on the mask. The friendly but firm smile she always used during HOA speeches. "Good morning," she called, approaching the crew like this was her press conference. "This is a misunderstanding, a tragic overstep by a disgruntled neighbor. Nothing was done outside the bounds of community protocol." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "You filed permits to host a private event on someone else's property?" Karen hesitated. "It was under consideration. The board approved a preliminary usage plan. We were in the process of—" "The documents show it was filed fraudulently," I cut in, stepping beside her, holding the city-approved demolition notice. She faked property lines, rerouted HOA funds to her own account, and built a champagne lounge on land that's never belonged to the HOA. Karen turned, face draining of color. "You don't have authority to speak on HOA matters." "I'm not speaking for the HOA," I said. "I'm speaking for myself, the actual owner of this land, and the city agrees." The reporter nodded, filming everything. Karen's jaw clenched, but she had no script for this moment. No clipboard to hide behind, no boardroom vote to shut me down. Just silence. and the sound of cameras clicking. Behind us, the wreckage sat in full view. Folded tents, crushed champagne bottles, broken furniture, her little kingdom in pieces. And for the first time since she roped off my lawn, Karen looked scared. The dust settled like a curtain dropping after a final act. The last tent pole was loaded into the truck. The champagne fridge, now a mangled cage of twisted chrome, glinted in the early sun. My grass, what was left of it, was muddy and torn, but it was mine again, every inch of it. The crowd didn't say much. Neighbors lingered on the sidewalk, arms crossed, hushed voices passing between them. Some nodded at me. Some looked stunned. One or two just stared at Karen as if seeing her for the first time. She stood alone now, a single figure in the middle of what used to be her fantasy. No clipboard, no entourage, no HOA board standing behind her. Just bare feet, trembling hands, and silence. Her voice, once so loud and certain, was gone. Every threat, every fake vote, every smug announcement she'd ever made, it all evaporated in the quiet. She tried to speak once, but nothing came out. Her mouth moved, but her eyes gave it away. She knew it was over. The news van packed up and left. The demolition crew drove off with 2 full dumpsters and a signed receipt from the city inspector who'd shown up halfway through. He didn't say much either. Just took one look at the fake permits and shook his head. I walked to the center of the lot, right where her throne-like armchair had once sat, and looked around. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. No ropes, no signs, no VIP access, just open space the way it used to be. Karen didn't say goodbye. She didn't scream or throw one last tantrum. She just walked off slowly, head down, heels in her hand, robe dragging behind her. A few board members followed at a distance, not out of loyalty, but because they didn't want to be left standing in the fallout. She'd built herself an empire out of intimidation and sparkle, and in the end, it took nothing but truth and time to tear it all down. I glanced at the edge of the lawn, where my original property marker still stood, still upright, still exactly where it had always been. I knelt down and pressed the soil around its base, smoothing it out with my hands. No more fake maps, no more gallonites. Just earth, just space, just peace. The land was mine. And finally, so was the silence.